What's going on, everybody? In this video, we're going to focus on completing the square. And we're going to focus on completing the square when the coefficient of a equals 1. Now, completing the square is another way for us to solve for x. We have quadratic formula, we have factoring, factor by grouping, and completing the square is just another method for doing that. The reason that we like completing the square is because eventually, when we start working with conic functions such as circles, ellipses, hyperbolas, we are going to need to complete the square in order to go from general to standard formula. Or standard form of those conic functions. So remember, this is the value of my a, this term is the value of my b, and my constant is the value of my c. So I'm going to be using those letters to just kind of help me explain a little bit more about completing the square. But I have 3 really simple steps for completing the square. And my first step is I'm going to move my constants to the other side. I'm going to move them away from x. Step 2, I'm going to take half of my b term, so half of b, square it, and then add that number to both sides. Once I've done that, I am going to complete the square. Now, it's very simple, but I'm going to do about 3 examples that help illustrate really what's going on here. So let's jump straight in to example number 1. So solve for x by completing the square. Well, what I want to do is I want to move my constants to both sides, or move my constant to both sides rather. And that's going to give me x squared minus 12x equals negative 11. Next, I'm going to take half of my b term. So 1/2 of 12 is 6. And then I'm going to square that, which gives me 36. And then I'm going to add this number to both sides. That's going to give me x squared minus 12x plus 36 equals negative 11 plus 36. Now, what I have right here is a quadratic. I can get a quadratic when I take 2 factors and multiply them together. Now, we have x and x. That's a given when our coefficient of a is 1. And then notice for my signs, I have a negative and a positive. Well, the only way to get a positive with that constant is if my 2 factors are negative. Because when we FOIL that out, my last process is always the last times the last. Well, a negative times a negative gives me that positive. So with that being said, I need to figure out what number is going to multiply to give me 36 and add to give me 12. Well, here's the trick. Here's the cheat. Whatever our b term was, half of that is the number that will work within our factors. And then when I have 2 factors next to each other, I can write it that are the exact same. We can say that it is squared. And that is where the whole completing of the square comes from, is when I take half of b and I square it and I add it to both sides. What I have done is I have created a quadratic that is now a perfect square. And I can rewrite my equation as x minus 6 squared equals negative 11 plus 36 is 25. So again, remember, they want us to solve for x here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and that gives me x minus 6 equals plus or minus 5. So I'm going to solve for x by saying x minus 6 equals 5, and then x minus 6 equals negative 5. Because remember, whenever we take the square root of something, we're going to have a plus or minus. So at this point, simple algebra. Add 6 to both sides. And for this equation, I get x equals 11. And then over here, we get x equals 1. And that is how I complete the square. It's very simple. Again, you're going to move your constants to both sides. I'm going to take half of b, square it, and then we are going to before we do that, we'll add 36 or add that number to both sides, and then I can write it in terms of my squared binomial. So now, let's try this again, and this time we'll do it a little bit faster. So my first step, move the constants to both sides. That gives me x squared minus 10x equals 8 minus 26 gives me negative 18. And then what do? Well, half of b is 5. Square it, and I get 25. So I'm going to add 25 to both sides. That gives me x squared minus 10x plus 25 equals negative 18 plus 25 gives me 7. So now I can write this as x. I have alternating signs here. So minus, and then remember, whatever half of b was goes in my squared binomial equals 7. At this point, I can take the square root of both sides. That's going to give me x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. So now I can solve. X minus 5 equals root 7. X minus 5 equals negative square root 7. Add 5 to both sides. And I get, I'll give you a little bit more room here. X equals 5 plus root 7. And then over here, when I add 5 to both sides, I get x equals 5 minus root 7. And there we go. Completing the square. Solving for x. Easy. One last problem. Complete the square. Again, subtract, move those constants so that they're away from my x's. X squared minus 8x equals negative 2. Half of b, well, that's 4. Square it. That gives me 16. Add that number to both sides. That gives me x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals, that's a 16, 14. At this point, put my x in, my signs are alternating, so it's minus. Half of that b value was 4 squared. I can take the square root of both sides. That gives me x minus 4 equals square root of 14, and then x minus 4 equals negative root 14. Add 4 to both sides. I get x equals 4 plus root 14. And I get x when I add 4 to both sides here, equals 4 minus root 14. So that's completing the square. I really hope that this helps. I hope it makes sense. We need to master this because it's an easy way for us to solve for x. But again, when we start working with conics, we need to be able to complete the square to move between the general and standard forms. So be sure to check out those videos of circles, parabolas, ellipses, hyperbolas coming soon. Thanks for checking out the video. We'll see you next time.